Have we seen anything like this before happen in the Middle East?
Well, shades of gray, right? We've seen obviously the sort of general conflict and the Israel in warring with other nations that are at least significant Muslim populations, and the United States backing them in one way or another. Sure, I mean, and obviously the U.S. Engaging with countries in the region directly, separate from Israel and bombing and those sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, even in the last few administrations, we've seen plenty of conflict, militarized conflict, primarily through air support. But obviously, going a little further back, full blown ground forces. But I think what makes this a little more unique is that the U.S. sort of joining in very publicly as kind of a full engage, at least for this moment in time, a fully engaged partner in a military action with Israel, as and I would hasten to add that I'm a congressional scholar telling you this, so you should ask political scientists with better expertise on that than me. But my quick interpretation is that no, like that has not happened quite in this format.
What are the instant reactions, do you think, saying about what just happened? I mean, it was kind of odd because it was so telegraphed in the last number of days. I know that there had been a 2 week deadline, but pretty much, people who have been following it had noted that there was definitely this possibility, and everyone knew where these sites were. And everyone knew at some point that the U.S. had the capabilities for it. I think it was when was going to happen.
I don't know if that wasn't my read, right? My read was, my read here is hindsight's 2020, and I saw just as many things sort of indicating that Trump gave the 2 week timeline, and the administration likes to give 2 week timelines. They lay sort of like they lay things out, and there's times when that's giving them they're not actually setting a deadline for themselves. That just sort of means we'll decide when we decide. But I think one of the things I would hasten to add is that the choice by the administration, I think, was at least in part a function of reading both the way that things had gone in the early, in Israel's actions from a military standpoint, and also looking a little bit at what was going on in Congress, right? So, there was, you know, certainly the administration was taking the temperature a bit of what their coalition, was going to, say about this. Now, did that ultimately dictate that they should take action? No, probably not as much as the fact that Israel was having some success and that they felt like this had gone strategically well. And so, there's a a momentum that the administration probably saw as an opportunity, to get on board with something that perhaps they saw as beneficial in the international scene, with certainly not without costs.
And what about we're seeing some Congress members, particularly one I just saw a tweet or post on X that this was unconstitutional, saying that Congress should have authorized this. That was Thomas Massey, of course, who's Republican, but not necessarily MAGA per se. What is your response to that? Because I know that Congress technically has to authorize war, or has that power when there's a war declared to then authorize it. How does this and how do maybe previous airstrikes in the recent months, especially maybe against the Houthis, not fall under that category, whereas maybe this congressman suggests they should have?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that goes back a long ways, right? The War Powers Act, for example, in the 70s, limits, congressional, requires that the president report the action to Congress within 48 hours and pull troops, within a fairly short period of time if there's troops involved. So there are limitations on that, but that sort of came on the heels of lots of action and lots of grappling between administrations and Congress about what did in fact qualify as an act of war, right? Because if you're a student of history at all, one of the things that you sort of are aware of is there have been many wars that weren't wars, over the last 75 years or so, where Congress never declares war, but we think of these as major conflicts, as long-standing conflicts, and relatively rare that Congress has declared war. And so, there's always going to be arguments, right? About, somebody's going to every time there's a military action, somebody's going to make the argument that this isn't constitutional by, the sort of authority, the declaration of war authority. So I don't think that's particularly novel. What I would say is interesting here, though, from a congressional standpoint, is really the fact that we have that it's kind of interesting set of cleavages that exist in both parties that create some real strange bedfellows in this particular instance, right? So, on the right, and maybe not exactly within the Trump coalition, but on the right, you've got sort of general hawks that are in favor of generally supporting Israel, right? Which has been sort of a something that's been a little bit of a change up in this administration, maybe more than previous, but also just in general, sort of hawks that are looking for that kind of action have a history of wanting to go after Iran. But at the same time, you've got a lot of isolationists, some of which are very much in the center of the administrators, of the Trump coalition, who are going to say, "Look, America first. We need to be isolationists. We need to not get involved in others' wars. We certainly don't need to be protecting Israel. We need to be focused on, our interests." And so that kind of division is an interesting one. But on the Democratic side, right? You've got this, when it comes to Israel, there's a long-standing contingent of supporters of Israel within the Democratic Party. And yet at the same time, right, you've got this sort of new cleavage that, is not only is sort of, not, it's kind of more anti-Israel, right? More than just not wanting to get involved and being doves, right? They are upset. The very progressive arm is so upset about the way that, a lot of the early actions by Israel with Hamas and with in Gaza unfolded, and so obviously we saw a year's worth of protests about it. So the Democrats are kind of split along these kind of, are we supporters of Israel, which there's a big contingent historically that are, or are we, progressives who are outraged not only by Israel's action, but certainly by the fact that we might be involved? And then there's the kind of classic doves, right, who are going to say, look, we shouldn't be getting involved in this, especially if there's not a humanitarian crisis. So there's just a bunch of cleavages going on in Congress right now that to me are the things that are going to unfold in interesting ways over the coming weeks.
And then I just want to read you the president's uh, truth, I guess, from Truth Social, uh, when he talks about something that I thought was interesting that he mentions here really fast is that he says all planes are safely on their way home, just trying to indicate that this is not, perhaps indicating, and maybe this is your interpretation, that he's not going to be having a large scale ground invasion or just putting more troops in harm's way, more so than just those B-2 bombers. Is that the indication? Is that the read that you get from that kind of remark?
I guess I'm not sure. I mean, I think, there's a lot of ways to go. My first reaction to it is to indicate that, there's no to ameliorate the sort of thought that we're putting American lives in jeopardy, right? And that, I don't know that I see it as being a forecast one way or the other about ground troops being involved or about a scaled up engagement. I very much doubt that, this will be the thing that Trump feels bound by in any way if he decides to, escalate in one form or another going forward. I take it as just him simply sort of being, you know, uh, patriotic and indicating a combination of U.S. strength by being to swiftly go in and do the damage that they did and get out, and also indicating that any criticism about him putting lives in jeopardy is unfounded. Right, that is what I take it to mean.
What are the political ramifications of this going forward? I imagine, especially when we think about those different wings of the parties, you may see people that, if this did affect civilians there, they would say, was this worth the price that of these deaths? As I know that a number of people will co-opt that from the those that are concerned with what's going on in Gaza as well. Is that kind of what we'd expect to see going forward? That plus the troops aspect of it too. Are we going to be there for a longer period of time? And does that then, I guess, expand to other parts of the region like the Houthis?
I don't think we're there yet. I think, this is too limited an action for us to have a widespread for the members of Congress to engage in a truly widespread conversation driven by concerns about, you know, American lives and in terms of, civilians, Iranians who are civilians that are affected. There'll certainly be that commentary, but that to an extent, at least, that comes up relatively often in military actions where there's bombing. And so I don't think it will come off as being, sort of overly shocking in a way that gives leverage to those that want to argue against it. The one thing that I would note, going forward and from a congressional standpoint is we're seeing lots of different bills introduced that are intended to be mechanisms to try to limit what the administration can do in terms of continuing in the in this war, not just sort of generic bills about war powers, war actions, but also specifically some of the bills are identifying Iranian action, right? They're trying to sort of limit this particular conflict. The reality is, though, that those are, I think, much more symbolic than they are functional at this point. Because I don't think there's a big, because I don't think there's a big enough. So those are more, symbolic than they are functional, because I think there's just not a big enough coalition yet to get past. I mean, forget about getting past the chambers themselves, right? If it were to get past that, the veto override, right, at 2/3 in each chamber is just very unlikely at this point. And so we see these bills, and they certainly, tell you something, especially where they're co-authored by these sort of strange bedfellows on far ends of the ideological spectrum. But the reality is that I think we have to have a major shift in what the conflict is and what the United States involvement is to try to create more of a coalition around some sort of action to limit what the administration can do in terms of their engagement.
And then last couple questions for you. Should we expect any sort of retaliation against the United States? I know concerns have been that there may be sleeper cells that are in the United States if it's not some sort of a ground operation against troops abroad or something of that sort.
That gets far enough outside of my expertise that I don't know that I can answer it intelligently, except to say that the probability of such a thing must go up as a function of this kind of action, because certainly we have a long history of recognizing that there are sort of organized terrorist activities associated with Iran and other countries or cross-country coalitions or groups from the region, and United States sort of military action has in the past aggravated and provoked some of those things. Whether they would come to fruition or not, I don't know that there's any way to know whether or not this particular action is the thing that's likely to provoke it. I don't know, but I do think that as you certainly that has been a consistent method of political violence in response to U.S. actions in the region over the course of the last 30 years, where a lot of military, a lot of political violence on that, where the military and the United States military has been involved on one side, has been met with much more sort of terrorist style and guerrilla, if you will, reactions on the side of countries in the Middle East.
And the last question is, what should we expect tomorrow when we wake up and when we're starting our day and perhaps starting next week? What does the world look like and how is it different than today?
Well, I think the conversation continues to get much more centered on uh,
Predict the world.
earlier this week I was sort of talking about political scientists sort of zero in on what they sort of define. We call it a state, but it's a nation state, right? We sort of a country, right? The definition of such is it's the entity in a given region, right, or in a given geographical area that is the only one that has a legitimate authority to use violence or coercive force. And I think when the biggest concerns about democracies are about whether or not the government is using that very, you know, that very fundamental and very, that very fundamental and that very precarious authority in a way that's consistent with governing citizens who govern themselves. Right. And I think the conversation that we're starting to have, where in California we see, this sort of fight about whether or not the National Guard can be mobilized within a state against the wishes of the governor on behalf of the administration. And externally, we see, conversations about whether or not the administration and the president is acting within the confines of his constitutional authority with respect to war. I think the conversation that we are beginning to have and that could continue in a more vigorous way is, are we at a point where we see some erosion of a sort of the constitutional democracy that we have taken for granted for a very long time? And I think the dueling sort of marshaling of the military internally and the marshaling of the military force externally within a few days of one another against some concerns that cut across party aisles in both actions, I think it will increasingly create some sobering recognition of where we're at, on that front. And there will be arguments on both sides, right? I mean, there will be those that will say, that's making too much of where we're at, and they'll point to similar situations in terms of bombings in the Middle East and other actions by presidents, and they'll point to situations that are at least sort of similar in terms of the National Guard, although none that match it quite like it did over the last half century. And many who will begin to, I think, could be more and more concerned about it, because really the reservation of that coercive political violence by the state, by the government is kind of the last line, right? As soon as that is no longer governed really by the constitutional system and by the sovereignty of the people that are being governed, we start to say that that's not a democracy anymore, right? From a political science standpoint, from a here's how we define the thing itself standpoint. And so I think we're not going to be there next week, but I think that conversation is going to get more prevalent, and people are going to start to put those things together in a way that feels concerning.